welcome everybody. Welcome to our fifth class, I believe, today. Today's Torah portion is Chayei Sara, which means the life of Sara. And the Torah portion opens with the death of Sara. It's very ironic, by the way, that you have the life of Sara, which really signifies the death, because it is only at death, of course, can we summarize the life of someone. But I'd like to actually begin our teaching today by referring back to last week's class when we talked about the binding of Isaac. And there was somebody there in the class that asked an excellent question, and I promised to take it up in one of our forthcoming classes, and I decided today would be a very good day to do that. And that question is, what happened to Isaac after the binding? Do we see any kind of effect, any influence, any long-term influence? Is there something that the Bible tells us that we can learn from it? What happened to Isaac? What was his response? Okay, so what I would like to do, basically, a number of things that we can see either directly in the scripture itself, or I would like to also bring some of the traditions, some of the Jewish traditions that are expressed through the commentaries and through the Midrash that give us a hint as to what happened to Isaac. Okay, so first of all, Rashi, who is the probably most classic commentator of the Bible, comments on the very first verse of this Torah portion when it starts talking about Sarah's death. And basically is responding to a question, is there any way, and this is also a very classic sort of question in Jewish commentary, Jewish study of the Bible, trying to see, is there a connection between the story that happened prior to this and the story that we are now about to read? So basically the question then becomes, is there any connection between the death of Sarah and the binding of Isaac? And the Midrash says absolutely, that what actually happened was Sarah found out somehow about this binding, and it's not, and there's different versions of the story. Did she hear that actually Abraham sacrificed Isaac, or did she hear that he was about to sacrifice Isaac? Whatever it is, she heard about this whole story. That, keep in mind, when we read about the story last week, there's absolutely no mention of Sarah. So, and it's fairly clear that Sarah was not brought into the plan. This Midrash, this tradition tells us that she found out about it, and therefore she got a heart attack, whatever, from the actual trauma of hearing about this near sacrifice of her son, she died. So one of the things that I guess what the Midrash is really trying to tell us, one thing I want to make clear when we talk about a Midrash, the Midrash has very rich sources and oral traditions. This is the way Jews told the story. This is the way Jews understood the story for centuries. But it's not the kind of story that you have to believe is true. You can, if you think, wow, that makes a lot of sense. Sure, that happened. But it's not written in the Bible, so we don't know for a fact it happened. But usually the most important part of understanding a Midrash is not necessarily the story it tells, but the message behind the story. What is the Midrash trying to tell us? And what the Midrash is trying to tell us, that in this story, the very minimalistic words about Sarah's final days and her death, there is something there that is trying to tell us, after the binding of Isaac, there was a trauma. There was some kind of wound that was opened, that was never really healed, okay? And so one possible consequence was, of course, that Sarah died right away. Let's go back and look at the end of the last Torah portion, the very, very end, in chapter 22, verse 19. We see, and this is after the binding is over, and how does it end? Abraham then returned to his servants, and they departed together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Where's Isaac? There's absolutely no mention of Isaac leaving with Abraham. And in fact, there is no further meeting, direct, personal meeting between Abraham and Isaac from this point, the departure of the binding, until Isaac comes to bury Abraham when he dies. Okay, so that is also, this has to say something. This has to say that there was some kind of separation, some kind of trauma, that at the end of this, Isaac went somewhere else. Now, also pay attention that here at the end of this verse, it says Abraham went back to Beersheba, but we know that Sarah died in Hebron. They weren't together. So even if you don't accept this Midrash that she died right away, what the Midrash may be saying is that this binding of Isaac caused a rift in the relationship between Abraham and Sarah, so that they were in two different places. She died in Hebron and he was living in Beersheba. The next question is, well, if Isaac did not go back to Hebron, if he didn't go back to Beersheba, where did he go? And in this week's Torah portion, we have a reference to that in chapter 24, verse 62. And this is this is after, we're going to deal with this a little bit, but this is at the very after the story of Eliezer bringing Rebecca. He's going to meet his new wife, etc. But there's a little geographic. Sometimes you learn a great deal by paying attention to some of these little details. Okay. So at the very end, we have as follows: just as Rebecca is coming with Eliezer to meet him, what does it say? And Isaac had just come back from the area of Be'er Lachai Roi, for he was settled in the region of the Negev. Be'er Lachai Roi. We know about this place. We've heard of it before. We've heard of it from Genesis 16, verse 14. And what happens in Genesis 16 is this is when Hagar is pregnant and Sarah is mistreating her and she runs away. And she is in the desert and an angel appears to her and tells her about the birth of Ishmael, who he will be. She gets a prophecy from this angel. And at that point, it says, therefore the well was called Be'er Lachai Roi. It is between Kadesh and Bered. Okay? This is where it is. First of all, it's in the south. Kadesh is on the Egyptian border. So it's quite south. It's south of Beersheba. And there's this place that got its name as a result of an event tied up with the birth of Ishmael. It's very possible this is a place where Ishmael was also living. But clearly, in Isaac going to this place and settling there, Bible is telling us that Isaac has some connection with Ishmael. He's not connected with Abraham. His mother, Sarah, has died, and yet he has gone to a place that has a connection to Ishmael. Okay? Now, not only do we learn here about where he goes in this place, but further on in chapter 25, one second. After Abraham's death, Ishmael and Isaac actually come together to bury him, and we're going to discuss that briefly later. But this is when Isaac returns to Hebron, not before. And well, he actually does return. He returns before with Rachel. That's with Rebecca. We go previously in chapter 24, verse 67. Isaac brings Rebecca to his mother's tent, so we can assume that that's in Hebron. And then he leaves again. How do we know he leaves again? Because at the end, when Abraham dies in chapter 25, we have in verse 11, after the death of Abraham, God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac settled near Be'er Lachai Roi. So this seems to be the place he keeps going back to, Be'er Lachai Roi, that place that connects him with Ishmael. So this clearly tells me at least, that we have some kind of a family dissonance going on here. And then there's one more hint, and something also that the Midrash picks up on, that talks about what happened to Isaac and what happened to the family. And this we see later on in a future Torah portion, next week's Torah portion, in chapter 27. Chapter 27, verse 1, we learn that Isaac is blind. And here again, we have a Midrash that comes to the rescue. We have a few Midrash stories, by the way, and Rashi, again, summarizes them with the following message. He said, when he was up there on the altar and Abraham was about to slaughter him, at that very same moment, the heavens opened and the angels above saw what was going on and they cried. And their tears came down upon Isaac's eyes. And therefore, his eyes dimmed. He was blinded, or somewhat blinded. Okay. Now, I think this is just a beautiful, beautiful midrash. And I once heard somebody make an amazing comment about this that I want to share with you. And he was saying, picture this: Isaac is on his back on the altar, looking up, and the angels are looking down. Okay. So as the heavens open, not only do the angels see Isaac, Isaac sees the angels. And what this midrash is basically saying, or one way of interpreting it, is that Isaac undergoes an amazing, intense spiritual experience. His eyes are opened to see into the heavens and giving him spiritual awareness and spiritual clarity, shall we say, that is rare for a human being. But at the same time, it dims his eyes to certain earthly realities. And that, of course, is something we see very much because in chapter 27, of course, something we'll deal with next week, we see the whole issue of Isaac blinded by his love for Esau and perhaps not really understanding who the real Esau is. And that is certainly something you get a sense throughout that whole story that it's Rebecca who really does understand what's going on, and Isaac is easily fooled and blinded to the reality. So that again is something that you can ascribe to an effect or a result from this experience of the binding of Isaac. Now, though, I want to move on to what is really the main theme of this Torah portion of Chayei Sara, and that is the next generation, passing on the torch, so to speak, from Abraham to Isaac. We spent quite a few sessions talking about God's promise to Abraham, God's promise to humanity, then God's promise to Abraham. And when it comes to the promise to Abraham, of course, we are introduced to the destiny and the destiny and mission of the Jewish people, which begins with Abraham and begins with the promise of children, which will become a nation, who will then inherit the land of Israel. That children and land are the two elements of that promise. So let's take a look at what we're dealing with in this portion and how we see that passed on to Isaac. So the first part of the portion, of course, dealing with Sarah's death, is the purchase of the Machpela cave in Hebron. And this in and of itself is interesting because what we're seeing here essentially is Abraham staking his first claim to the land, okay? In anticipation of passing this land or passing something concrete in the sense of land to Isaac. And what it is he's passing on is the ownership of the Machpela cave in Hebron, where he will bury Sarah, where he himself will be buried, where Isaac and Rebecca will be buried, and where Jacob and Leah will be buried. So this, indeed, in its most practical, physical sense, is the first ownership in the land of Israel that is passed on to the next generation. Now, I always love taking a look at the dialogue between Abraham and the Hittites when he's coming to purchase the cave. It's very interesting. A lot you can talk about. First of all, of course, it's a classic Middle Eastern bazaar. Abraham, but kind of in a reverse direction, because Abraham offers to buy it offhand, and the Hittites want to come across as being very generous. No, you don't have to buy it. I'll give it to you for free. You're a friend. Wonderful. You can bury your dead here. And then, of course, when it comes down to when Abraham insists on the price, they mention a very, very expensive price. 400 pieces of silver is a lot of money. I want to take a look at some of the repetition that we see here, which also points to something very interesting. Okay, so the first time we said we're in chapter 23, verse 9. This is the first where Abraham actually puts forward his request. He says, "Let him sell me the cave of Machpela that he owns, which is at the edge of his land. Let him sell it to me at the full price for a burial site in your midst." Okay, he keeps talking about being sell, and where it is. There should be absolutely no misunderstanding as to what he wants. Then the response of Ephron: "No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people." So if Abraham keeps talking about a sale, Ephron keeps talking about a gift. Okay, so that in the repetition, we see the contrast between the two of them. And then on to verse 13, where we have Abraham's response. "If only you would hear me out. Let me pay the price of the land, accept it for me that I may bury my dead here." So again, he's going back to buying it. Okay. Now look at what happens afterwards. The deal is done. They agree. Verse 17. Now here I want to focus on a particular word in Hebrew. The word is vayakom. Vayakom we have as the beginning of verse 17 and the beginning of verse 20. That word actually means to stand up or to rise up. Okay, it stood. Okay, and the word is used in the translation that I have in English. It's used to denote the passing of ownership. Ephron's land in Machpela near Mamre passed to Abraham. Okay, but the actual word that's used means literally to stand up. So we have a sense here that in this passing there is a standing up, a saluting to Abraham, or perhaps even a going up, an ascent in spirituality or in value, in the greatness of the person when it going from Ephron is going up when it ends up in Abraham's hand. But now let's pay attention to the incredible repetition here. So Ephron's land in Machpela near Mamre, the field with its cave and all the trees anywhere within the confines of that field, passed to Abraham as his possession in the presence of the Hittites, of all who entered the gate of his town. And then Abraham buried his wife Sara in the cave of the field of Machpela, facing Mamre, now Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Thus the field with its cave passed from the Hittites to Abraham as a burial site. Just in case you missed it, okay, over and over again, the cave with its field passed from Ephron, past the Hittites to Abraham. This is a transaction that the scripture is telling us, please pay attention. The details are important. The transaction is important. Here we have something major happening. And if that's not enough, we have this actual transaction reported in similar repetition later on. First of all, when Abraham dies, at the end of our current portion, in chapter 25, verse 9. Is it? Here we go. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpela, in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, facing Mamre, the field that Abraham had brought from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried, and Sarah his wife. Again, we know about this cave. We know about the Hittites. It's already Abraham's. Why do we have to get? As if Scripture is trying to. Don't forget, Abraham bought this. He bought it, and it's his, and it doesn't belong to the Canaanites anymore. And then later on, at the end of Genesis, when we're referring to Jacob's impending death, and after his death, we have the same sort of repetition. In Genesis 49, verse 29, here Jacob is turning to his sons, and he says, "I am about to be gathered to my kin. Bury me with my fathers in the cave which is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave which is in the field of Machpela, facing Mamre, in the land of Canaan, the field that Abraham bought from Ephron the Hittite for a burial site. There Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried. And there I buried Leah. The field and the cave in it bought from the Hittites." Okay? And one more repetition after Jacob is actually buried in chapter 50, verse 13. Let's see. his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpela, the field near Mamre, which Abraham had bought for a burial site from Ephron the Hittite. This clear, okay? This is the first claim. This is the first physical claim in the land of Israel, and it is significant. Hebron is significant. This purchase is significant, and it is so significant that it is not just a burial place where Abraham, his son Isaac, his grandson Jacob will be buried with their wives, but that the very nature of the claim, the fact that this is a claim that went from the Hittites, the Canaanites, to Abraham, that in and of itself is so important and something that must be passed on. So in a sense, then, what we see happening here is this transfer of that part of the promise. The claim to the land in a physical way is actually transferred from Abraham to Isaac in its direction of moving down the chain, okay? Now, the next aspect, of course, is children. We talked about two parts of the promise, the land and children. Children, of course, being those who will be the children of Abraham, who will then eventually become the nation of Israel. And so here we see that as well at the very, right after this whole story of the burial, we move on to the next story in Chayei Sara, and that's the story of finding Isaac a wife. And it is very clear here, we are not looking at romance. We are not looking at, Isaac isn't even involved in choosing his wife. She's chosen for him. And indeed, there's actually hints as to who she is, even before we get to our actual Torah portion, because in chapter 22, where are we? Chapter 22, right before our Torah portion begins, in these little few verses that actually connect the binding of Isaac with Chayei Sara, with the death of Sarah, we have these few verses that seem to be not relevant. It's genealogy. Abram found out that his brother had children, and then we have a list of children. But it was all about this one verse, Bethuel being the father of Rebekah. What has happened here, just before that we learn about the Sarah dying and all that, Abram finds out that Rebekah is born. And so in a sense, coming right out of the binding of Isaac, we already have the continuity. If the binding of Isaac presented the greatest challenge to the promise, in the fact that Abraham would have to sacrifice his one and only heir, Isaac, and of course that is thwarted, thank God, thanks to God's own interference. The answer to that also comes right immediately after. It's not just that he survives, but that he will have his wife, because at that same time, God is telling us, by the way, Rebekah's born. So she's there, she's waiting in the wings. And so it's not a romantic, they will love each other, of course. Scripture tells us that, and it's actually rare that scripture tells us about love between a husband and wife, but it does tell us that between Isaac and Rebekah. But it is all really set in motion by other people, many in a way that, if you think about it, in a royal family, for example, marriages of royal kings and queens and princesses until modern times is not something that, is decided based on love. It's decided in the best way to perpetuate the dynasty. And so that's the kind of situation we have here. Anyway, he has a wife, he's continuing. That, of course, is very, very important. And one of the ways at the end of the story, when Eliezer brings her back, and I mentioned this in passing earlier, but I want to go back to this verse again. This is chapter 24, verse 67. Isaac then brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he took Rebekah as his wife. Isaac loved her and thus found comfort after his mother's death. And I would like to read this number one to give us a sense that was initially he did come back to Hebron before going back to Be'er Lahai. But I think this is not about geography, and this is not only about finding comfort after his mother's death, but it's about Isaac. As soon as Rebekah comes in to the position of Sarah, then we have a real heir, because Isaac inherits Abraham, but Rebekah inherits Sarah. And as a couple, they become the next patriarch and matriarch. They become the next parents of the nation of Israel, that as a couple can then bring forth the next generation and create the nation. Now, just one thing I want to end with, and that is, I mentioned earlier that Isaac goes back to Be'er L'chai Roi. He clearly has some kind of a relationship with Ishmael. And we talked about it before as perhaps an expression of a kind of separation from Abraham, a bit of a separation from, the family that was going on before then, and going off and attaching himself a bit outside. I mean, Ishmael's his brother, but he's clearly an outsider. But at the end, when we have the death of Abraham, this is chapter 25, verse 9, okay? Abraham dies, and here we see a very powerful message, okay? First of all, Ishmael, we have it in verse 9, his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpela. The fact that Isaac and Ishmael come together to bury Abraham is very interesting, because it does indicate that there's, aside from the hints that we picked up before, just coming from Be'er L'chai Roi, what we do see from this is that indeed there is a relationship between the brothers, and they both come together to bury their mutual father. Now, Isaac is mentioned first, and there are Jewish commentaries who note that because he is mentioned first, even though he is not the real firstborn, Ishmael is older, but in putting Isaac first, it's a recognition that Ishmael himself also agreed to, in that it is Isaac who is the heir of Abraham. Ishmael is the son, and he gets what he gets, but it is Isaac who is the heir to the promises. And by coming together, there's a certain recognition on the part of Ishmael accepting that position. And we see that continuing later on. Just right after this section, we have a section beginning with, this is the line of Ishmael, where we have the descendants of Ishmael. We have the names of his children, and we have in here names that become nations and plague tribes and whatever. But at the very, very end, it says where they lived. It says he died, doesn't say where he was buried. But in verse 18, it says, they dwell from Havilah near Shur, which is close to Egypt, all the way to Ashur. They camped alongside their kinsmen. And it is very clear from this that Ishmael and his descendants left Canaan. They not only, you have this symbolic coming together to bury Abraham, but it's very clear that Ishmael himself understood that his place is not Canaan. And so we have the portion ending really with the sealing of the passing of the torch to the second generation, both in the purchase of the cave of Machpela, where Abraham and Sarah will both be buried, and the fact that it is Isaac who is there as the heir, as the firstborn, and Ishmael leaves. Ishmael goes outside of Canaan. He goes in the direction of Egypt. That is what I have to say today. I think this is a very important Torah portion, and I hope you enjoyed our lesson. We have time for maybe one comment, if anybody has it, before we sign off. Anybody who has a question or something? If not, we can just see you again next week.
Can I say something?
Sure.
Maybe you said it, because I left for a second, I got a call, that actually Yitzhak, who was really from the Akedah, he was really, all his life he's the only one who did not leave the land of Israel.
Right, that's right. I didn't mention that, but that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true.
Because there it's safer, Abraham left, so I think it's
excellent. Excellent. I just want to respond to this one comment now before we check off. There is a recording of every single one of these things. I'm putting in my email here. It is, if you are not getting emails from me, please let me know. I just put my email in. Let me know, or go onto our website at CFOIC.com. Give me your email. I will make sure that you have the links to the recordings, and I will also be sure that you get reminders every day for each class, for every Thursday for the class before it starts. Okay? Anyway, thank you all. Have a wonderful Shabbat, a wonderful weekend.
That
was great, Sondra. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Shalom.
Thank
Shalom.
you.
Bye-bye.
Shalom. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.